Traoré's bold move to block the attempts of powerful external forces like former U.S. President Donald Trump's Circle and the International Monetary Fund from seizing 70% of his nation's gold reserves over outstanding debt obligations has sent shockwaves across global markets, raising urgent questions about sovereignty, the role of natural resources in economic independence, and the future balance of power in Africa. To fully understand what this means, we need to go deep into the global financial system, the history of gold as collateral, the IMF's influence on indebted nations, and how leaders like Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso are redefining the narrative of African ownership of resources. The first thing to understand is that gold is not just a shiny metal, it is the backbone of financial security for many nations. As of 2023, central banks around the world hold over 35,000 metric tons of gold as reserves, with the United States leading at more than 8,100 tons, Germany at over 3,300 tons, and the IMF itself holding around 2,800 tons, making it the third largest holder globally. Gold is universally accepted, doesn't lose value the way currencies do through inflation, and becomes a lifeline when nations face debt crises. For African countries, where currencies are often weak and vulnerable to external shocks, gold reserves are even more critical. Now the IMF traditionally uses debt restructuring as a tool to impose conditions on countries. These conditions often include austerity, liberalization, privatization, and sometimes direct control or claims over natural resources. In the 1980s and 1990s, African nations from Zambia to Ghana experienced what became known as structural adjustment programs, which left their economies open to foreign exploitation while national debt still grew. Burkina Faso, a small but resource-rich country, is not the largest gold producer in Africa, but it is significant. In 2022, Burkina Faso produced about 58 metric tons of gold, placing it among the top 5 producers on the continent. Gold accounts for nearly 80% of the country's export revenues. That means if 70% of these reserves were handed over or seized by creditors, the country would lose not just its financial cushion, but its entire economic sovereignty. Ibrahim Traoré, the young leader who came to power through a popular military-led transition in 2022, has consistently spoken against neo-colonialism and foreign interference. His rhetoric, echoing the legacy of Thomas Sankara, emphasizes sovereignty, African unity, and resource control. By blocking attempts at gold seizure, Traoré is not simply making an economic decision, he is making a geopolitical statement to the entire world. Let's analyze why the IMF and Western powers would push for such a seizure in the first place. Global debt has reached record highs, with developing nations collectively owing over $9 trillion as of 2023. The IMF's loans, while intended to stabilize economies, often become traps. For instance, in 2022, Ghana turned to the IMF for a $3 billion bailout, agreeing to conditions that slashed subsidies and increased taxes, sparking nationwide protests. Sri Lanka's debt crisis showed the world how strategic assets, like ports, could be leveraged or lost when a nation fails to meet obligations. In this context, Burkina Faso's gold becomes a tempting target. The idea of a 70% seizure, whether symbolic or actual, represents the extraction of wealth at the expense of local populations. But Traoré's refusal complicates matters. Trump's name being attached to this issue reflects broader U.S. interests in African resources. Even after leaving office, Trump maintained influence in economic networks and continues to represent a school of thought that prioritizes America's economic gain, often through aggressive deals. The U.S. has historically leveraged IMF influence to secure access to strategic resources. If Traoré blocks that path, it is not just an economic rebuff, but a direct challenge to U.S. geopolitical influence in West Africa. What happens next depends on several scenarios. The first is retaliation. History shows us that leaders who resist Western economic dominance often face intense pressure. Thomas Sankara, who nationalized land and resources in the 1980s, was assassinated in 1987, widely believed to have been supported by foreign interests, threatened by his policies. Muammar Gaddafi of Libya, who sought to establish a pan-African gold-backed currency, was overthrown in 2011 after NATO intervention. Traoré's stance could similarly provoke sanctions, diplomatic isolation, or even covert destabilization efforts. The second scenario is regional solidarity. Across West Africa, there has been a rising wave of anti-French and anti-IMF sentiment. Countries like Mali and Niger, also under military transitions, have shown signs of aligning with Burkina Faso against external pressure. The three have even spoken of forming a confederation, pooling resources and defense strategies. If this alliance strengthens, it could create a new block of resistance to IMF conditions, reshaping the financial map of Africa. The third scenario is the role of alternative partners. With growing multipolarity, nations like Russia and China are stepping in as alternative lenders and investors. China, through its Belt and Road Initiative, has already invested hundreds of billions across Africa, often accepting resource-backed repayment structures. Russia, meanwhile, has built military and economic ties with Burkina Faso and other Sahel nations, presenting itself as a partner free from colonial baggage. If Traoré can secure deals with these powers, he may bypass IMF control altogether, though this introduces new risks of dependency. Let's dig deeper into the numbers to illustrate what is at stake. Burkina Faso's external debt stands at around $4 billion, a modest figure compared to larger economies, but massive relative to its GDP of about $19 billion. Gold reserves are the country's strongest asset, with exports generating over $2.5 billion annually. Losing control of 70% of this would mean giving up nearly $1.8 billion worth of resources each year, essentially crippling national finances. Compare this to Ghana, which had to pledge future oil revenues to creditors in previous debt negotiations. The consequences are severe: loss of public services, currency collapse, and heightened poverty. So Traoré's resistance is not just symbolic, it is survival. But here is the twist: global gold markets are shifting. In 2022 and 2023, central banks bought more gold than at any time since the 1950s, led by countries like China, Turkey, and India. They are preparing for a world less reliant on the US dollar. If Burkina Faso retains its gold, it could join this shift, using the reserves to back a stronger national currency or as leverage for trade with non-Western partners. This is where the story gets more global. If more African nations follow Traoré's path, rejecting IMF control and holding onto their gold, the IMF's influence could weaken dramatically. Western economies, already struggling with inflation and geopolitical challenges, could lose a key mechanism of resource extraction. On the flip side, if Traoré fails, if Burkina Faso is pressured into giving up its reserves, the message to other African leaders will be clear: resistance is costly, and the global financial system remains unshakable. What happens next, therefore, is a battle not only for Burkina Faso's gold, but for the future of global economic order. Will the IMF and Western powers double down, risking instability in the Sahel, or will they back off, allowing a precedent of African resource sovereignty to grow? Will Traoré survive politically, given the history of leaders who resisted, or will he fall victim to the same cycle of external interference? These are the questions the world is watching closely, because gold is not just a resource, it is power. Whoever controls it controls independence. And right now, the world is seeing a young African leader daring to say no in a system built on saying yes. This defiance could either inspire a new era of African sovereignty or trigger new conflicts designed to maintain old hierarchies. Either way, the decision to block 70% gold seizure is not just about Burkina Faso, it is about rewriting the rules of global finance. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more.